first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Mary McCoy for making our speaker's visit possible, and also Center for Southeast Asian Studies, everybody for making this possible. I'm delighted to introduce the speaker today. Dr. Julie Chernov Hwang is an associate professor of political science and international relations at Goucher College. She's a very productive scholar in both Southeast Asian studies and political science. She is the author of 3 books and many articles, and is very actively currently working on her 4th book. I believe it's under review at Oxford University Press. And she conducted field research like places like Boso, which is the highly dangerous or conflict area, and she spoke with I don't know what's the proper word, but jihadists, or used to be jihadists, or many people like that. So she has done that. So just to give you some idea about her books, her most recent book is Why Terrorists Quit by Cornell University Press in 2018. There's a edited volume that she did with Quinn McCam. It is the 2014, The Islamist Parties and Political Normalization in the Muslim World, which actually I use in my class. And her first book came out in 2009. It's about peaceful Islamist mobilization in the Muslim world and what went right. And this one was actually translated in Indonesia, translated in Indonesian language. And so to mention a few of her journal articles, she published in many, like political psychology, Asian security, Asian survey, Southeast Asian research, nationalism and ethnic politics, and contemporary Southeast Asia, and many more. So now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Chernov Hwang. Welcome.
Thank you, Dinja. I'm so happy to be here today to discuss my research. I'm currently wrapping up a book that examines the pathways to entry into Indonesian and Filipino Islamist extremist groups. And so now that I'm working to revise that, work on that conclusion, this is the first place that I'm actually speaking to the trends in the research. In the interest of time, and in the interest today of having maximum time for Q&A, I really am going to focus on the Indonesian case. And I will allude to the Philippines case at a few points, but if you would like me to speak to the Philippines, if you would like me to speak to Malaysia, I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. So the book I'm writing, which I'm tentatively calling right now Becoming Jihadis, joining Islamist extremist groups in Indonesia and Philippines. It really looks at several questions. I'm going to focus very heavily on 2 today. It focuses on these questions of why do people join Islamist extremist groups, so motivations, what are the pathways via which they join, specifying that there are multiple pathways, there isn't just one linear pathway. Third, what does commitment look like? And which I'll allude to briefly. And fourth, which I will not discuss today, but again, we can talk about in the Q&A, is role. How do people get chosen for different roles? What does somebody do once they are? So today we're going to focus really on these first 2 questions with some brief closing on that third question of commitment. But before I get into the results and the argument and the nuts and bolts of the case, what I would really like to do is speak a bit to the methods, because the methods are important here. Between 2010 and 2019, so the before times, before COVID, changed our lives. I conducted 150 interviews with current former, and inactive members of Indonesian Islamist extremist groups in 14 cities. That should say 12. 12 Indonesian Islamist extremist groups. With that sample, I was able to go back and have follow-up conversations with many of those 97 over those years. My sample is skewed male because in order to interview wives of jihadists, I had to build first close relationships with the husbands. So at present, I've interviewed 91 men and 6 women. I conducted these interviews on the islands of Java, Sumatra, and Sulawesi, 14 cities across Java, Sumatra, and Sulawesi. And in addition to this, I used court transcripts and NGO reports to compile dossiers on another 13. I also conducted interviews with former and inactive members of 2 Filipino Islamist extremist groups in Marawi and Butig in the Philippines in 2019. And I was not able to get permission to go to Malaysia. So I was interviewing Malaysians in exile in Indonesia and Malaysians who were willing to fly to Indonesia for interviews. And from that, I was able to have another 11 Malaysians in the study, many of whom were related to the Malaysians in exile. Now, I can't emphasize enough how important it is if you are going to do research on terrorism. It is so important, and extremist movements, you have to interview the extremists themselves. And this is surprisingly not hard to do in Indonesia. And the reason is that Indonesia is more open. It is not, somebody is not going to go to jail from shouting. There's plenty of organizations that advocate for an Islamic state and Islamic law. There's plenty of Islamist extremist organizations on that fringe, from paramilitary groups to Salafi jihadi groups to Takfiri groups. It's a highly competitive sphere. And there are people who work on terrorist rehabilitation. There's academics, there's journalists, and they have subsets of people that trust them. You know those people, you can find the doorway in. And then you go back again and again and again to the same people. Because the first time you do an interview, the person may not trust you. You might get a very surface conversation. But you go back again, you take the person out for coffee, maybe ask a little clarifying question, but just see how they're doing. Then you go back again, and you have another interview. And over time, they begin to trust you. They begin to like you, or at least tolerate you. And you are able to drill down. You ask questions that didn't occur to you in that first interview. They give you their personal narrative in more color. And you get a deeper understanding. There's people that in those 9 years, I interviewed every year I went. And I always came away with something new. And sometimes it was a formal interview with a recorder. But just as often, it was somebody cooking me dinner in their home with my guide, and me asking one little clarifying question as we talked about things that were completely irrelevant to my research. So I came away having that little bit of understanding, that little clarifier that I needed. But I built the rapport. And so that's something very important when you're doing this kind of research. Go back again and again and again. Build your relationship with them. So even if you bring the guide because you feel more comfortable, you don't need the guide to vouch for you anymore. You go back, you build the relationships, you build the rapport, and then you get the good data. And that's how this research is done. It's slow research. It's a lot slower than working with a data set. But it's research you can trust, because when you find those patterns, you can have confidence in the patterns. So what I did was I took all of this data, I coded it, and I discerned broad patterns. But I also wrote life histories. I took my interviews of people who had an interesting story to tell, with whom I had that trust. And I wrote partial life histories and life histories. And my book juxtaposes those stories against the patterns data. So my fieldwork locations were, I was in Banten, Jakarta, Bandung, Central Java, Yogyakarta, East Java, Central Sulawesi, and Pekanbaru. And in the Philippines, I interviewed in Manila, Marawi, and also the small town of Butik. I only did one interview in Manila with a former member of Abu Sayyaf group. But my mob group contacts were in Manila and Marawi. I'm sorry, we're in Marawi and Butik. And they were, many of them were former members of MILF. They came from MILF families, and they joined the mob group. Now, these were the Indonesian jihadist groups represented in this study. I'm going to make an argument to you today that while many factors motivate a person to join an Islamist extremist group, what makes a person stay, what makes them commit, what makes them participate in acts of terrorism is first and foremost social. Becoming a member of an extremist group is first and foremost a social experience. You're joining a community of people who share beliefs, norms, values, goals, and a deep, quasi-familial, sometimes familial, commitment to one another. And I'm going to show you today that it is not ideology that is driving this most often. It's feeling like, to use a colloquial, you found your ride or die friends. So let's take a look first and foremost at motivations in Indonesia. I have a slide for motivations in the Philippines as well at the very end, so I can throw up this data for Philippines. People who join an extremist group in Indonesia, at least in my sample of 150 interviews and 97 people, it was a confluence of two things: who they knew and what they sought. Most often, a family member, less often a teacher or a friend, gives them an entry point. But that was rarely sufficient to cause someone to join this group in and of itself. It had to fulfill a need. If your parents were in the group, or your much revered older brother was in the group, sometimes it was enough. But most often, it was the confluence of who you knew and what you sought. So if we look at those, you can see that, let me make this work. Okay. So family and friends were the who you knew. And the most popular factors for what one sought was seeking knowledge about Islam and jihad, seeking revenge, and less often altruism, seeking to improve the lives of Muslims, and seeking redemption. Now, the revenge factor was specific to Poso. You didn't see revenge outside of Poso. And 26 of my respondents came from Poso. In this, they sought revenge for the 2001 Wali Sungla massacre, where more than 100, mostly women and children, were slaughtered by Christian militiamen at a mosque and Islamic boarding school at Wali Sungla. Those who lost family members and relatives, they wanted to avenge their deaths. But also, more of my respondents pointed to seeing headless bodies drifting down the river for about a week. And that imbued them with a sense of outrage and vengeful solidarity. If we put that group aside, since it's Poso specific, then seeking knowledge about Islam and jihad, this is not saying, oh, if you seek knowledge about Islam, you're going to want to join an extremist group. Absolutely not. It's seeking practical knowledge about jihad. Or people seeking knowledge of Islam where they're trying to find the purest variant. And so they seek and they go towards the Salafi groups. And then that's not enough. So then they might go towards the Salafi jihadi groups, and there they feel they found their people. And you saw that more with Dar al-Islam before Jamaat Islamiyah. For a lot of young men, it was seeking practical knowledge about jihad. I want to be clear. Young men seeking knowledge about jihad is like young American boys seeking knowledge about the US military. They want to play soldier. Some young boys want to play mujahid. You know, there's a certain glorification. But young men who want to seek practical knowledge, they're not satisfied with learning about jihad, the abstract. They want someone to teach them to use a gun. They want somebody to teach them how to make weapons. They want that training. They want a real and tangible understanding of jihad in terms of being trained. That's the identifier there. And I would say if you broke down that group, more sought knowledge about, were older, and they had joined Dar al-Islam seeking a pure understanding of Islam that they couldn't get in Suharto, Indonesia. So they migrated to Malaysia in order to join Abdullah Sungkar's study groups. A smaller proportion of that group was seeking the practical knowledge. And they tended to be younger and had come of age in the late 90s and early 2000s. Redemption was an interesting factor. One thing that I found, you see a lot in the literature on white supremacy, that trauma. A lot of these people who join these extremist groups have unresolved trauma. Christian Picciolini calls them potholes, potholes that cause life to veer off course. With the Indonesians, some had trauma, some didn't. Growing up in Poso, seeing headless bodies down the river, that's going to give you trauma. But a number of these guys, most of them, I think, trauma, some had trauma, some didn't. It was a wash. But seeking redemption, it could be seeking redemption for living a sinful life. For women who gravitated towards Islamist extremist groups seeking redemption, it was oftentimes they'd been divorced, they were disowned by their family, they had a kid out of wedlock, they decided to seek knowledge in religion. We can see this in Nava Narania's work on migrant maids, on migrant workers who were maids who became radicalized. And this was the story. It was certain aspects of, their life that they felt were sinful, and then they turned and said, you know what, I'm going to try to be better. And that instinct, they just kind of gravitated towards what they saw as pure, and then stumbled on extremist study circles. With men, the bar was higher. It was a multi-dimensional crisis. Not only did they get divorced, but they went bankrupt. They lost their business, they lost their car, they lost their house, they lost the dog. Nothing was going right. If we look at seeking to improve the lives of Muslims, the terrorist fundamentally is an altruist. And a lot of the people who got involved in Islamist extremist groups saw themselves as seeking to improve the lives of Muslims. Whether it was people who joined Team Hisbah because they wanted to clean up their neighborhood, and eradicate vice and crime in their neighborhood, or young men from Java who wanted to go to Ambon to protect Muslims. They were seeking to improve the lives of Muslims. So I'm going to shift gears now to pathways. There's two types of pathways: internal pathways and external pathways. Internal pathways is my reference for people who were either born into a movement or somehow tied to it. And there's two major types: kinship and schools. And I would put in teachers, oftentimes with schools. External path, then there's 3.5 external pathways: communal conflict, study sessions in prisons, and social media. The numbers for social media were even smaller. Kinship refers to family ties. And there's 4 different types of family ties. Number 1, parents. Number 2, siblings. Number 3, uncles. And number 4, extended family or relatives. And extended family or relatives really plays in the Philippines more so than Indonesia. For schools, there's about 70 radical boarding schools in Indonesia, most of which are affiliated with Jemaah Islamiyah or one of its affiliates. Now, external pathways are for those people who were not born into the group, who did not have a relative offering them entry into the group, who didn't have that tie. Conflict speaks to communal violence in Ambon and Poso. And prison, you have some people being radicalized in prison. So, for those to take the schools pathway for a moment, those who went to Jemaah Islamiyah affiliated boarding schools had a similar experience as those who joined via kinship. Those who joined via kinship, depending on who you were, you had either an expedited pathway to entry if your parents were members already, siblings, it depends on how high they were in the group, but oftentimes there was a level of trust because you had a relative in the group that was vouching for you. So your pathway to entry may not have been expedited, but you were immediately trusted. You were immediately one of them. Now, for those who went to schools, Jemaah Islamiyah affiliated boarding schools, they had a similar experience with constructive kinship. Their friends in the schools, they saw them 24/7. Their teachers, they saw them 24/7. They shared rooms, they shared meals. Their family, their friends and their teachers became as influential or even more influential in their lives than their parents. There is an overlap in that many people who had parents in the movement were sent to Jemaah Islamiyah schools to instill the correct mindset. Now, study circles, this is just the virtue of my sample. My sample is study circle heavy. Study circles were also a social experience. So what we see here, again, we see the emergence of the social. With kinship, it's your parents, it's your siblings, it's your favorite uncle, it's your loved ones. With schools, it's people who have become like family. Study circles are also a social experience, where in-group brotherhood can supplant out-group family or exist alongside it. This was a longer process. It could take you, depending on the group, it could take you half a year to a year if you were joining a group like Jamaat Ansharut Tawheed by study circles. For Jamaat Islamiyah, it could take 4 or 5 years. They were a multi-tiered, multi-layer, slow process of indoctrination and vetting. But there was also a strong social component because these are the guys you could count on for everything. You need to borrow a motorcycle, somebody's going to offer it. You want to get married? Someone will offer their sister. You're homesick? Someone will give you encouragement. And these guys become bound by a common worldview, but also they feel a duty and obligation to help one another and be there for one another. Doesn't matter if one person is a doctor and the other parks cars. If they're in the same study circle, they're equal and they help each other. And that is a profoundly social experience. And remember what I said when I started out in Indonesia. You have so many different social movements and so many different groups and so many different Islamist groups and so many different Islamist extremist groups. There's so multiple groups. You saw on my list groups on the Salafi jihadi fringe. So it can't be just ideology why a person joins this group and not that. The key is you find your ride or die. The key is you find your people. You're bound by common worldview, a common goals, and you find your people. Now, if you joined in a conflict zone, so conflict is your pathway, you had a modified study circle pathway. There were layers and levels of vetting. But depending on the group, it could be 3 weeks, it could be a month. It was expedited because there was a need for fighters. So you didn't wait a year to 4 years to bring someone in. You were talking about weeks to months. In prison, the pathway was far less formal. The motive was different. In prisons, there were some people who joined out of a sense of protection. But more often than not, the fact that prisons were gang-ridden and the food was absolutely inedible and atrocious, and the jihadi groups were good at protecting, and they had access to edible food. So jihadi gangs had good food. They knew how to protect prisoners. They could hold their own in a fight. They were respected for their religious knowledge. So some people gravitated to the jihadi notables for redemption, but far more gravitated to the jihadi notables for protection and good food. Upon release from prison, a handful continued their activities. They might go to a jihadi school, they might start attending study circles, but there was no instance that I could document where someone received an oath in prison from JI or one of its affiliates. ISIS held oaths in prison, and that did happen with them. Now you may be asking what happens with online radicalization. Online radicalization in Indonesia, also Philippines, it's not a pathway. In my sample, it's a partial pathway. In my sample, I found that social media reinforced ideologically what someone was learning, either in real time, or it could be a gateway through which a person could be invited to real-time events. You don't, as Heckhammer pointed out in his study of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, you don't recruit online because you can't vet somebody online. You can't get a gut feeling of somebody online. You can't signal to them and see if they match your signals. Online, you could be being infiltrated. Online, the person could be a cop. So Indonesians typically want to get them in real time. There are specific points at which online helps. Online can also help you, for example, if you want to create a bomb-making study group. Online can help you if you want to make sure people get further indoctrination. But online was used as a reinforcer at specific points. I didn't see a single case where someone went through the whole pathway online. Indonesian groups, ISIS or JI affiliates, tended to bring you into real time as quickly as they could. So I want to read you this quote from one of my interviewees to speak to that intersection of who we know and what we seek, of who they know and what they seek. Also, to highlight that study circle pathway. And I call this guy Khaled. I was the leader of a drug gang, and then the Petrus killing started, and I fled Banten, West Java to hide out. While in Banten, I met somebody called Asif Sutardi. He was an incredible person. He guided me out of the darkness. Asif Sutardi was a nephew of the commander of Darul Islam, and his grandfather was Achengan Masjid. Turned out I was meeting some of the people high in the organization. Asif Sutardi held a religious study group. It was by invitation only, secretive. I performed istiqamah, discovering the right path. I regretted my past life. I left it behind. I learned Tawheed, divine awareness of God, and Aqidah. Then I attended paramilitary training in West Java, where we learned martial arts, self-defense, and play sports. You had to go through all these different levels, and I was doing it step by step. The process went on for more than a year. I was then inducted by Pat Baroto into Darul Islam, and in 1981, I was offered the opportunity to go to Afghanistan. So what you see here, who he knew, he met Asif Sutardi. What he sought redemption. What was the pathway? Study circle pathway. Layer after layer after layer for more than a year, step by step by step by step. Then he commits, he gets inducted, and he gets a role. He goes to Afghanistan. Now, it's important to say that these pathways are not linear or forward moving. Sometimes a person halts their journey. I remember interviewing one person, and I said, why didn't you go further? He said, I worked full time. Last thing I wanted to do when I got home was go to a study session. I want to sit on my couch and watch TV. So he just didn't go any further. However, should a person proceed, they're going to hit certain benchmarks. They will become socialized into the group's ideology. They'll make fast friends in the group, friends who will become family. And should they pursue membership, they will express commitment by conforming to social and religious group norms, by obeying orders, by prioritizing their in-group friends, and on some occasions, by relocating to live closer to them. Those who migrate by internal pathways are more likely to commit for the long term, or to migrate among like-minded groups, because as I said in the beginning, there's so many different groups in Indonesia, the barriers to moving between them are quite low. So, those who joined via conflict or via prison were more likely to join by the short term, because their participation was situational. So in sum, to close, this research supports the contention that social relationships, kinship, brotherhood, friendship, mentorship, drive joining and commitment both in pathway and motive. Ideology, loosely understood, acts as a binding agent, creating a common vision, purpose, and worldview that reinforces that sense of commitment. One joins, an extremist group via an internal pathway or an external pathway, and the internal pathways are often expedited. This is a social story. This is a social narrative. And I'll leave you there and open up for questions.